You think you understand medieval justice, but the truth about torture devices is far more horrifying than anything you've ever imagined. We're not talking about simple punishments here. We're talking about machines of agony so twisted that they reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Devices so brutal that even the executioners themselves would sometimes refuse to operate them. What you're about to discover will shatter every assumption you've ever had about medieval torture. These weren't just tools of punishment. They were psychological weapons designed to break the human spirit in ways that went far beyond physical pain. From the horrifying truth about who really invented these devices to the shocking reality of how they were actually used, these are the dark secrets that historians have been reluctant to discuss. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval torture wasn't just about extracting confessions or punishing criminals. It was about something far more sinister, a systematic approach to human suffering that reveals truths about power, control, and the capacity for evil that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human civilization. The inventors were not who you think they were. Let's start with the most shocking truth about medieval torture devices. Most people assume these machines of agony were created by sadistic medieval executioners or designed by cruel kings obsessed with punishment. The reality is far more disturbing. Many of the most horrific torture devices were actually invented by some of the most educated minds of their time. We're talking about scholars, engineers, and even members of the clergy who applied their intelligence and technical expertise to the systematic infliction of human suffering. The rack, one of the most feared torture devices in history, was refined by university-educated engineers who calculated the precise amount of tension needed to dislocate joints without immediately killing the victim. The Iron Maiden, that terrifying sarcophagus lined with spikes, wasn't created by some bloodthirsty barbarian. Historical records suggest it was designed by craftsmen who understood human anatomy so well they could position the spikes to cause maximum agony while avoiding vital organs, ensuring the victim would remain conscious for as long as possible. But here's where it gets truly twisted. The Catholic Church, an institution supposedly dedicated to mercy and salvation, was behind some of the most sophisticated torture devices ever created. The Inquisition didn't just use existing tools, they commissioned entirely new devices specifically designed for extracting confessions of heresy. The strappado, where victims were hung by their wrists tied behind their backs, was refined by church officials who documented the exact angles and weights needed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive for extended interrogations. What makes this even more horrifying is that these weren't crude instruments thrown together by angry mobs. These were precision-engineered machines that required advanced knowledge of physics, anatomy, and metallurgy. The brazen bull, where victims were locked inside a bronze sculpture and slowly roasted alive, included an intricate system of pipes that transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling a bull's roar, turning human agony into a grotesque performance. The most disturbing part is that many of these devices were created not out of sudden rage or primitive justice, but through careful planning and intellectual consideration. Learned men would sit in comfortable rooms sketching designs and calculating measurements for machines whose sole purpose was to inflict unimaginable suffering on other human beings. The combination of intelligence and cruelty required to create these devices reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature itself. The psychological torture was worse than the physical pain. While the physical agony of medieval torture devices was undeniably horrific, the psychological warfare these machines inflicted was often far more devastating and lasted much longer than the physical wounds. The mere sight of these devices was designed to break people before they were even used. Torture chambers weren't hidden away in dark dungeons by accident. They were deliberately constructed as theaters of terror, with devices prominently displayed and previous victims' blood stains left visible as psychological weapons. Many confessions were extracted not through actual torture but through the pure terror of being shown what would happen if victims didn't cooperate. The thumbscrew, which might seem like a relatively minor device compared to others, was actually a masterpiece of psychological torture. The slow, methodical turning of the screw created anticipation that was often more unbearable than the actual pain. Victims would be forced to watch as the device was slowly tightened, knowing that each turn would bring increased agony, but never knowing when the torture would end or how much worse it would become. But the truly diabolical aspect was the unpredictability. Torturers would deliberately vary their methods, sometimes stopping just short of permanent damage, other times continuing until victims were permanently maimed. This uncertainty meant that even when the physical torture ended, victims lived in constant fear of its return. The psychological scars lasted far longer than the physical wounds. The breaking wheel demonstrates this perfectly. Victims weren't just broken and left to die. They were positioned so that crowds could watch their prolonged agony, sometimes for days. The knowledge that their suffering was being observed and even enjoyed by spectators added layers of humiliation and psychological torment that went far beyond the physical breaking of bones. Perhaps most twisted of all was the way these devices were used to turn victims against their own loved ones. The pair of anguish, a device that expanded inside bodily cavities, was often used not just to extract confessions from the victim, but to force them to provide information about family members and friends. The psychological torture of being forced to betray those you loved was often more devastating than any physical pain the device could inflict. The executioners themselves were often psychologically damaged by their work. Historical records describe executioners who became alcoholics, suffered from what we now recognize as severe mental illness, or required increasingly extreme methods to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. The tools designed to break others ultimately broke those who wielded them. They were used far more frequently than history admits. The sanitized version of medieval history suggests that torture was rare, reserved for only the most serious crimes or used sparingly by particularly cruel rulers. The archaeological and historical evidence tells a very different story. Torture devices were as common in medieval society as courtrooms are today. Every major town had not just one or two torture devices, but entire collections of specialized instruments. Archaeological excavations of medieval sites consistently uncover torture implements, suggesting they were standard equipment for local authorities. The Spanish Inquisition alone is estimated to have tortured over 150,000 people. But that was just one organization in one country over a limited time period. What's truly shocking is how routine and bureaucratic torture became. Court records from medieval England show that torture was used not just for serious crimes like treason or heresy, but for relatively minor offenses like theft or adultery. The process was so standardized that there were official protocols for which devices to use for which crimes, how long torture sessions should last, and what constituted an acceptable confession. The economic aspect reveals just how widespread torture really was. Professional torturers were full-time employees, not occasional specialists. They had apprentices, standardized training, and even professional guilds. The manufacture of torture devices was a legitimate industry with skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work and competed to create more effective instruments. Local authorities didn't just own these devices, they invested heavily in maintaining and upgrading them. Account books from medieval towns show regular expenditures for repairing torture equipment, purchasing new devices, and paying torturers salaries. This wasn't occasional brutality, it was institutionalized suffering supported by significant financial resources. The frequency of use is also evident in the wear patterns found on surviving devices. The grooves worn into torture tables, The metal fatigue in mechanical components, and the bloodstains that have soaked so deeply into wood that they're still visible centuries later, all point to regular, repeated use. These weren't museum pieces or intimidation props, they were working tools that saw constant action. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that torture was often used not to extract confessions or punish crimes, but simply to maintain social control. Periodic public torture sessions served as reminders of what happened to those who challenged authority. The devices were tools of political oppression disguised as instruments of justice. The victims included people you'd never expect. When we think of medieval torture victims, we typically imagine criminals, heretics, or political prisoners. The reality is that torture devices were used on a much broader spectrum of society, including people whose only crime was being vulnerable or different. Women were disproportionately targeted, often for crimes that had no male equivalent. The scold's bridle, a metal cage that locked around a woman's head with a spike that pressed against her tongue, was used to punish women for talking too much, gossiping, or arguing with their husbands. The ducking stool was specifically designed to torture women accused of being nagging wives or dishonest merchants. Children were not spared from these devices. Historical records document the use of torture on children as young as 7 years old, often to extract information about their parents or to punish them for minor thefts. The same devices used on adults were simply scaled down for smaller victims, showing a level of systematic cruelty toward the most vulnerable members of society. The mentally ill were frequent victims of torture, as their behavior was often interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or witchcraft. Rather than receiving care for their conditions, they were subjected to devices designed to drive out evil spirits, often resulting in permanent physical damage or death. The restraint devices used in medieval treatment of mental illness were essentially torture instruments disguised as medical equipment. Religious minorities faced systematic torture regardless of their actual crimes. Jews, Muslims, and various Christian sects were tortured not just for practicing their faith but for existing as perceived threats to religious uniformity. The devices used were often specifically designed to mock or defile religious practices, adding spiritual torture to physical agony. Perhaps most shocking was the torture of the poor for economic crimes. Debtors, beggars, and those who couldn't pay taxes were subjected to devices designed to extract payment or punish poverty itself. The practice of torturing people for being unable to pay debts created a cycle where victims were permanently maimed and therefore even less able to support themselves. Elderly people were tortured for witchcraft accusations, often because their knowledge of herbal remedies or their eccentric behavior made them convenient scapegoats for community problems. The same wisdom that might have made them valuable in other societies made them targets for torture devices in medieval Europe. The devices evolved into something far worse than intended. What started as crude instruments of punishment gradually evolved into sophisticated machines of prolonged suffering, engineered with terrifying precision to maximize agony while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The original concept of torture was supposed to be quick extraction of information or swift punishment for crimes. But over time, the devices became more complex and cruel, designed not just to cause pain but to create specific types of suffering that could be sustained for hours or even days. The iron chair, covered in spikes and heated with fire underneath, evolved from a simple restraint device into a machine that could slowly cook a person alive while the spikes prevented them from losing consciousness. The progression toward greater cruelty was driven by a twisted form of innovation. Torturers and device makers competed to create more effective instruments, leading to increasingly sophisticated mechanisms. The rack evolved from a simple stretching device to a precision instrument with gears and pulleys that could apply exactly the right amount of tension to dislocate joints in a specific sequence. What makes this evolution particularly disturbing is that it was driven by detailed observation of human suffering. Torturers kept careful records of which techniques produced the most reliable confessions, which devices caused the most fear, and which methods could be sustained longest without killing the victim. This systematic study of human pain led to increasingly refined instruments of torture. The breaking wheel demonstrates this horrifying evolution perfectly. What began as a simple method of execution became an elaborate torture device where victims were carefully broken in stages, with specific bones targeted in particular orders to maximize suffering while keeping the victim conscious. The final version included mechanisms to ensure the victim could survive for days in agony before finally dying. The economic incentives actually encouraged this evolution toward greater cruelty. Professional torturers were paid based on their effectiveness, creating market forces that rewarded innovation in inflicting suffering. The more reliable a torturer was at extracting confessions, the more work they received, encouraging the development of more effective devices. The psychological understanding of fear and pain also advanced, leading to devices that targeted specific human fears. The coffin torture, where victims were locked in wooden boxes barely large enough for their bodies, was designed to exploit claustrophobia and the fear of being buried alive. The devices evolved to incorporate multiple forms of psychological torture alongside physical pain. Perhaps most disturbing is that this evolution never stopped. Each generation of torturers built upon the knowledge of their predecessors, creating an accumulated wisdom of human suffering that grew more sophisticated over time. The devices found in later medieval periods show a level of understanding about human anatomy and psychology that rivals modern knowledge, all focused on the systematic infliction of pain. The dark truth about medieval torture devices isn't just that they existed or that they were used frequently. It's that they represent a systematic application of human intelligence and creativity to the problem of causing suffering. They reveal a capacity for deliberate, calculated cruelty that goes far beyond simple brutality or primitive justice. These devices were the product of advanced engineering, detailed anatomical knowledge, and sophisticated understanding of human psychology, all focused on a single goal: the infliction of maximum suffering. They show us that the capacity for evil isn't limited to ignorant barbarians or primitive societies, but can emerge from the most educated and supposedly civilized minds. The legacy of these devices extends far beyond medieval times. The techniques and principles developed by medieval torturers influenced methods of interrogation and punishment for centuries afterward. The systematic approach to breaking human will and extracting information through controlled suffering became a template that was refined and adapted by later generations. What's most disturbing is that the creation of these devices required the same intellectual curiosity and problem-solving skills that drive positive human achievements. The same minds that could have created art, advanced medicine, or beneficial technology instead chose to focus their abilities on perfecting human suffering. This reveals something deeply troubling about human nature itself. If these dark revelations about medieval torture have opened your eyes to the hidden horrors of human history, there's so much more disturbing truth waiting to be uncovered. The systematic cruelty we've explored today was just the beginning of humanity's capacity for calculated evil, and the techniques developed in medieval torture chambers influenced methods of oppression that continued for centuries afterward.